The silence in the marble corridors is the most unnerving part. It is not a peaceful silence, it is a heavy watchful quiet, the kind that absorbs sound and smothers whispers. You are a junior secretary in the imperial court at Nicomedia, and your hands, though clean, feel permanently stained with ink. Moments ago you were summoned to the emperor's private study to retrieve a stack of charters. He did not look at you. His gaze was fixed on a single wax tablet on his desk, his jaw set so tightly that the muscles in his temples were visible even in the flickering lamplight. It is the face of a man calculating the value of a life or the cost of its removal. As you gathered the documents, you saw a name scratched onto the tablet, a name everyone knows, a name spoken with admiration in the barracks and with reverence in the provinces. Now walking back to your own small chamber, the name echoes in your mind, not as a symbol of glory but as a death warrant waiting to be signed. In this world of absolute power you understand that loyalty is a currency, and today its value has crashed. You have just seen the cold, quiet machinery of the state pivot towards one of its own. This feeling of precarious existence, of life and legacy resting on the silent whim of a single man, is the unwritten context for the official record. Before we unseal these forgotten archives, consider this a moment to register your presence. A like serves as your signature, and a subscription grants you access to all future findings, provided you believe these stories must be unearthed. And in the comments below we invite you to name the historical figure you believe has been most fundamentally misunderstood by posterity. And now the preamble is over. Let us turn to the primary sources and begin the slow work of reconstruction. To understand the tragedy of 326 AD, we must first understand the world that forged its architect. The Roman Empire, at the close of the fractured and bleeding entity staggering from the 50-year period known to historians as the crisis of the 3rd century. It was an era of endemic civil war, of breakaway empires in Gaul and Palmyra, of barbarian incursions across the Rhine and Danube, and of an economy in freefall. Emperors rose and fell with shocking regularity, often proclaimed by their legions and assassinated by the same men months later. The very concept of a stable, unified Roman state was in jeopardy. Into this chaos stepped a man of formidable administrative talent and ruthless will, Gaius Aurelius Valerius Diocletianus. Ascending to the throne in 280, for AD, Diocletian recognized that the empire was too vast and its problems too numerous to be governed by one man from one capital. The old system was broken. His solution was not a mere policy change, but a radical reinvention of the imperial office itself. This was the tetrarch, why the rule of four. The political architecture was predicated on a division of labor and responsibility. The empire was split administratively into eastern and western halves. Diocletian, as senior emperor, or Augustus, took the eastern region of greater wealth and strategic importance. He appointed a trusted military colleague, Maximian, as his co-Augustus in the west. Each Augustus then adopted a junior emperor, or Caesar, who would serve as his deputy and designated heir. Diocletian chose Galerius as his Caesar, while Maximian adopted Constantius Chlorus, a respected general from the Balkans. This system was designed to mitigate the two primary causes of the preceding crisis: unwieldy borders and violent succession disputes. With four emperors, each assigned a quadrant of the empire and stationed at a strategic capital: Nicomedia for Diocletian, Medialmana for Maximian, Sirmium for Galerius, and Trier for Constantius. The state could respond to multiple threats simultaneously. An uprising in Britannia no longer required the emperor to abandon the Persian frontier. More revolutionary, however, was the intended mechanism for succession. The tetrarch was an attempt to replace the principle of hereditary dynasty with a form of meritocratic appointment. The Caesars were chosen for their military and administrative capabilities, not for their bloodlines. The theoretical plan was elegant in its simplicity. After a reign of 20 years, the two Augusti would abdicate. Their Caesars would then be promoted to the rank of Augustus, and these new senior emperors would in turn select new capable Caesars to serve under them. It was to be an imperial college, an orderly transfer of power that would in theory end the cycle of sons of emperors assuming they had a birthright to the throne, a belief that had so often led to civil war. This was the system into which Flavius Valerius Constantinus was born. His father Constantius was a key pillar of this new imperial structure. Yet Constantine himself represented everything the tetrarch was designed to render obsolete. He was the biological son of a Caesar, a living embodiment of the dynastic principle in an age that had formally rejected it. He existed as a political problem from birth, a loose thread in Diocletian's carefully woven imperial tapestry. While his father governed Gaul and Britannia from Trier, Constantine was kept far away, a gilded hostage in the eastern courts of Diocletian and Galerius, where his loyalties could be monitored and his ambitions contained. The system that brought his father to power was the very system that barred his own path. This fundamental conflict would define his youth and set the stage for the violent dismantling of Diocletian's grand design. At the heart of this conflict was the question of his birth. Constantine's political vulnerability was rooted not in his mother's. The historical record concerning Flavia Julia Helena is sparse and often colored by the hagiography that followed her son's Christian conversion. Later ecclesiastical historians would elevate her to sainthood, casting her as a pious and noble figure from the outset. The secular sources, however, particularly those hostile to Constantine's reign, paint a far more humble picture. The 6th century historian Procopius, echoing earlier sentiments, is clear on the matter. Helena was a native of Vpa in Bithynia, a town of little consequence, and she was by trade as abila, an innkeeper or barmaid. It was in this capacity, the account suggests, that she met the ambitious soldier Constantius Chlorus. The precise legal nature of their relationship remains a subject of academic debate. It may have been a formal marriage under provincial law, or it may have been the more common arrangement of concubinatus. For the Roman social elite, the distinction was critical. Concubinage was a recognized and stable union, often long-term, but it was typically entered into by individuals of significant mid-different social strata, such as a senator and a freedwoman. Critically, the children of such a union did not hold the same legal status or inheritance rights as the offspring of a formal marriage between two Roman citizens of comparable rank. Whether by marriage or concubinage, Constantine was born around 272 AD in Naissus. His mother was a commoner from the Greek-speaking East, a fact that would have been a significant social impediment in the deeply class-conscious world of the Roman aristocracy. This liability was politically weaponized in 293 AD. When Diocletian elevated Constantine as father to the rank of Caesar, in the West it came with a non-negotiable condition: to be fully integrated into the imperial college, to be bound by blood to his new Augustus Maximian. Constantius was required to put Helena aside. He was then married to Maximian's stepdaughter Flavia Maximianae Theodora. This was a purely political transactionist and had practiced to solidify alliances among the tetrarchs. For Constantius it was the price of power. For Helena it was a public repudiation. For the young Constantine it was a formal declaration of his own diminished status. The new marriage was fruitful. Constantius and Theodora would have 6 children, creating a second, more legitimate imperial family. These house siblings of Constantine were born in the purple, their lineage tied directly to the ruling Augustus. Constantine, by contrast, was now the son of a Caesar's discarded first partner, a relic of a past that was politically inconvenient. It is at this point that he was dispatched, or more accurately retained, in the east, serving at the courts of Diocletian and later Galerius, serving at the courts of Diocletian and later. His official role was that of a high-ranking military officer, a member of the elite protector res domestici. His unofficial role was that of a political guarantor, well kept hostage to ensure his father's continued loyalty. Life in the Eastern Court would have been an education in calculated survival. He was under the direct observation of Galerius, a man who, according to the Christian polemicist Lactantius, harbored a deep animosity towards him. Galerius, a fervent believer in Diocletian's system, saw in Constantine the very dynastic threat the Tetrarch was designed to eliminate. He allegedly placed Constantine in positions of extreme danger on the battlefield, hoping for a convenient accident to solve a political problem. Yet Constantine not only survived but thrived, distinguishing himself in campaigns on the Danube and the Persian frontier. He learned to navigate the treacherous currents of the court, to mask his ambition behind a veneer of dutiful service, and to cultivate allies within the army. His parentage forced him to be better than his rivals. He could not rely on an unimpeachable claim to succession. His legitimacy had to be forged in military victory and political acumen. This prolonged 2-decade apprenticeship in the East under the watchful eyes of his potential enemies shaped him into a patient, observant, and ruthless political operator. While his father ruled in the West with a new family, Constantine learned the hard lessons of power. In the East, that lineage was a weapon. that could be used against you, that alliances were temporary, and that survival depended on anticipating the actions of those who saw you not as an asset but as a threat. The act that had officially marginalized him, his father's politically necessary marriage, would set a precedent he himself would later follow, binding his own fate to the very imperial family that had supplanted his mother. The carefully constructed artifice of Diocletian est at Ra began to fracture on May 1, 305 AD. On that day, in a ceremony outside Nicomedia, Diocletian did the unthinkable. He voluntarily abdicated his power. On the same day, his colleague Maximian reluctantly did the same in medial manner. As planned, the Caesars Galerius and Constantius were elevated to the rank of Augusti. The system for a moment appeared to be working. The critical next step was the appointment of two new Caesars. The biological sons of the emperors Constantine and Maximian's son Maxentius were widely expected to be chosen. They were the most prominent and experienced young men of the imperial circle. Galerius, now the senior Augustus and a staunch defender of the Tetrarchy, had other plans. In a move of deliberate political exclusion, he bypassed both Constantine and Maxentius. He appointed two of his own loyal lieutenants, Flavius Valerius Severus as Caesar to Constantius in the west and his own nephew Maximinus Daia as his Caesar in the east. For Constantine, who was present at the ceremony, this was a public humiliation and a clear signal that there was no legitimate path to power for him within the existing structure. He remained at Galerius's court, his position now more precarious than ever. His value as a hostage had increased, as had Galerius's motivation to eliminate him. What followed was a desperate gamble. According to the account of Lactantius, Constantine repeatedly requested permission from Galerius to join his father Constantius, who was preparing for a campaign in Britannia. Galerius repeatedly stalled. Finally, he appeared to relent, signing the official travel warrant late one evening but instructing Constantine to report for final orders the next morning, allegedly with the intent of creating a new pretext for delay. Constantine, anticipating this, fled the court that very night. In a dramatic detail that may be an embellishment but captures the urgency of the flight, he is said to have hamstrung the post horses at every station along his route to prevent pursuit. He raced across Europe and reached his father at Soria cum modern Bologna, just as the latter was about to sail for Britain. The reunion was a pivotal moment. Constantine joined his father's successful campaign against the Picts. But Constantius, who had been in poor health for some time, died at Eboracum modern July 25, 306 AD. The legions of Britain, fiercely loyal to his father and impressed by the young Constantine, acted immediately. Ignoring the Tetrarchy system entirely, they reverted to the older tradition of hereditary succession and acclaimed Constantine as Augustus. This single act shattered Diocletian's model. The political situation across the empire devolved into chaos. Galerius, enraged but facing the reality of Constantine's powerful army, refused to recognize the title of Augustus, but offered a compromise, granting him the lesser rank of Caesar. Constantine, a pragmatist, accepted. Meanwhile, the snubbing of Maxentius in Rome had created its own resentment. In October of 306 AD, the Praetorian Guard and the citizens of Rome, feeling marginalized by the new system of provincial capitals, proclaimed Maxentius emperor. The Tetrarchy was now a tangled web of competing claims. It was in this volatile environment that the need for a strategic marriage arose. Maximian, Constantine's old antagonist, was drawn out of his forced retirement by his son's rebellion. Anxious to reclaim his former glory and influence, he saw in Constantine a potent ally. Constantine controlled the formidable legions of Gaul and Britain. He was a proven military commander. His weakness, however, was legitimacy. His title of Caesar was a reluctant concession from his enemy, and his claim to Augustus was backed only by his own troops. He needed a connection to the imperial establishment. Maximian provided the solution. He traveled to Constantine's capital at Trier in 307 AD and offered a formal alliance. He would recognize Constantine's rank as Augustus, giving him the validation Galerius denied him. In return, Constantine would join him in alliance against Galerius and the other recognized emperors. The seal of this pact was to be a marriage. Constantine would marry Fausta, Maximian's youngest daughter and Maxentius' sister. Fausta was no commoner like Helena, or a partner of ambiguous status like Constantine's first companion Minervina. Fausta was a nobilis sima femmina, or woman of the highest nobility, the daughter of an Augustus. The marriage was a masterstroke of political theatre. It retroactively legitimized Constantinus' position, grafting him onto the Herculi, an dynasty founded by Maximian himself. For Constantine, it was a repeat of his father's own history, a politically necessary union that superseded a prior, less advantageous relationship. The ceremony was lavish, cementing an alliance that rayed the political map of the Western Empire. But in bringing Fausta into the heart of his court and eventually his family, Constantine introduced a powerful, new variable into the dynastic equation. This necessary imperial marriage solved an immediate political problem, but it planted the seeds of a future and far more personal tragedy. Before the strategic union with Fausta, Constantinus' personal life was already a matter of state. His firstborn son Flavius Julius Crispus was born around the year 300 AD, though the exact date and location are not preserved in the surviving records. The identity of his mother Minervina is even more obscure than that of Helena. The sources refer to her either as a concubine or as Constantinus' first wife. The ambiguity is significant. If she were a wife, Crispus was legitimate from birth. If she were a concubine, his status was more tenuous, dependent entirely on the official recognition of his father. Regardless of the legal technicalities, when Constantine arranged his marriage to Fausta in 307 AD, Minervina disappears entirely from the historical record. She was likely repudiated, unpensioned, or for casualty of political necessity, just as Helena had been before her. Crispus, however, was not discarded. Unlike his half-siblings by Theodora, who had overshadowed his father's youth, Crispus was Constantinus' only son for many years. He was brought into the imperial court at Trier and raised under his father's direct supervision. As Constantine fought a series of brutal civil wars to consolidate his power, in the west first against Maximian and then against Maxentius, the young Crispus was being groomed for a future role in the government. The historical sources are silent on his early childhood, but we know he was placed under the tutelage of Lactantius, one of the most prominent Christian scholars of the age. This suggests that from an early stage Constantine intended for his son to be well versed, not only in military and administrative matters, but also in the tenets of the faith that Constantine himself was beginning to publicly champion. Crispus first enters the public record in a significant way on March 1, 317 AD. On this day at Sc. Constantine, now the undisputed master of the West, after defeating Maxentius, sought to regularize the succession. He elevated Crispus along with his own infant half-brother Constantine, I.I. Fausta's firstborn son and the son of his eastern rival Licinius, to the rank of Caesar. The appointment was a clear statement of dynastic intent. Crispus, at around 17 years of age, was now formally designated as the heir apparent. Coins were minted across the Western Empire bearing his image and the title nobilis. Simus Caesar, most noble Caesar. Inscriptions on official documents celebrated him as the future of the Constantinian dynasty. His official duties began almost immediately. He was given nominal command of Gaul with a staff of experienced administrators and generals to guide him. This was a traditional posting for an imperial era training ground where he could learn the arts of governance and warfare in a relatively stable and loyal province. It was a role his own father had fulfilled under the first tetrarchy. From his seat in Trier, Crispus soon proved that his command was more than nominal. In 321 AD, he led successful military campaigns against the Franks and the Alemanni along the Rhine frontier, securing a significant victory that further burnished his reputation. He was not merely the emperor's son, he was a competent and increasingly popular military leader in his own right. The imperial propaganda machine worked to amplify these successes. Panegyrics from the period extol his virtues, praising his martial prowess, his wisdom, and his piety. He was presented to the empire as the ideal era reflection of his father's best qualities under guarantee of future stability. For Constantine, who had spent decades fighting to secure his own legitimacy, the existence of a capable and popular adult son was an invaluable asset. Crispus embodied the promise of a smooth and orderly succession, a stark contrast to the chaotic and bloody struggles that had characterized the collapse of Diocletian's system. As Crispus was celebrated as the heir, his father's new family with Fausta was also growing. Following the birth of Constantine I in 316 AD, Fausta would go on to have two more sons, Constantius II in 317 AD and Constans in 323 AD, as well as two daughters. For a time the two branches of the family appeared to coexist. Crispus was the undisputed senior Caesar, the eldest son, the proven commander. Fausta's children were infants or young boys. The line of succession seemed clear and secure. But the very structure of this family, a popular adult heir from a previous union and a brood of younger royally born sons from the current empress, created a latent structural tension. It was a classic dynastic dilemma, one that had played out countless times in Roman history. As long as Crispus was the sole viable heir, his position was unassailable. But as Fausta's sons grew older, the dynastic equation would become increasingly complex and ultimately fatally unstable. The imperial court of the early 4th century was a system predicated on the display of unity, but internally structured by competing interests. At the apex stood Constantine the Augustus, whose absolute authority was the central organizing principle of the state. Below him, two distinct lines of succession were now taking shape, each with its own maternal figurehead and its own potential claim on the future. The first line was represented by Crispus, the son of Minervina. He was the proven heir, celebrated in public inscriptions as spes rei publicae, the hope of the state. His legitimacy was based on primogeniture and demonstrated military competence. He was the son of his father's youth, a tangible link to the struggles that had brought Constantine to power. The second line was embodied by the three sons of Fausta, Constantine I, Constantitius I, and Constans. Their claim was of a different nature. It was rooted in the prestige of their maternal lineage. Fausta was not a woman of obscure origins. She was the daughter of the Augustus Maximian and the sister-in-law of Maxentius. Through her, the children were descendants of the Herculean dynasty, a powerful legitimizing factor. Furthermore, they were the sons of the reigning empress, born not before but during Constantine's tenure as the supreme ruler of the West. Their birthright was tied to the current imperial marriage, the central political and social institution of the court. For nearly a decade, from 317 to 326 AD, these two lines coexisted in a state of apparent equilibrium. Crispus was the active heir, campaigning on the frontiers and being groomed for supreme power. Fausta's sons were children, their future roles still undefined. The official propaganda of the empire presented a single unified imperial family, the Domus Divina or divine house. Coins were minted showing Crispus alongside his young half-brothers, projecting an image of fraternal harmony and dynastic continuity. Beneath this carefully curated surface, however, the structural tensions were undeniable. Every military victory won by Crispus enhanced his personal prestige and strengthened his claim, but it also potentially cast a longer shadow over his younger siblings. His popularity with the army, the ultimate arbiter of power in the Roman system, was a significant asset for his father, but it could also be perceived as a potential threat by his suspicious court. An overly popular general, even an emperor's son, could become an alternative locus of loyalty. Fausta's position in this dynamic was complex. As empress, her primary duty was to secure the succession for her own children. Her influence was not wielded on the battlefield, but within the enclosed, politicized world of the imperial palace. This was a realm of whispers, of carefully chosen words, of access to the emperor's ear. Her power lay in her ability to shape her husband's perceptions, to manage the intricate web of alliances and rivalries among courtiers, and to advocate for the advancement of her sons. The historian Zosimus, writing over a century later, but drawing on earlier, now lost sources hostile to Constantine, explicitly frames the subsequent tragedy as the result of Fausta's ambition. He alleges that she viewed Crispus as a direct impediment to the succession of her own children and actively sought to remove him. Whilst Zosimus's account is colored by a clear anti-Constantination bias, the underlying political logic is sound. In any monarchical system with a blended family, the potential for conflict between the offspring of different mothers is a constant. The court would naturally have polarized into factions. Those whose careers were at Aristath, the administrators who served under him in Gaul, would have seen his succession as the path to their own continued influence. Conversely, courtiers and officials who sought the favor of the empress, or who believed the future lay with her sons, would have aligned themselves with her interests. This tension was not merely theoretical. It manifested in the distribution of honors and titles. When Constantine I was made a Caesar at the same time as Crispus, it was a signal that the son of Fausta, despite being an infant, was being placed on a nominally equal footing with his accomplished adult brother. As Constantius I and Constans were born, the imperial pie was in theory to be divided into ever more slices. The question of who would ultimately inherit supreme authority, the position of Augustus, remained unanswered. Would Crispus rule alone with his brothers as junior partners? Or would the empire be partitioned among them? Constantine left these questions, deliberately ambiguous perhaps, to maintain control, but in doing so he allowed the space for rivalry and suspicion to grow. The two lines of imperial blood, one representing the past and the present, the other representing the future, were set on a collision course within the claustrophobic confines of the imperial court. While the internal dynamics of the imperial family were slowly evolving, the external political landscape of the empire remained violently contested. By 312 AD, the Tetrarchy system had devolved into a complex civil war with four remaining contenders for power: Constantine in the west, Maxentius holding Italy and north, the Coalitiones in the Balkans, and Maximinus Daia in the east. It was in the autumn of this year that Constantine, having already secured Gaul, Britannia, and Hispania, made a decision of immense strategic risk. He crossed the Alps and invaded Italy to eliminate his rival Maxentius. His forces were significantly outnumbered, but they were battle-hardened veterans of the Rhine frontier. After a series of swift victories in northern Italy, Constantine marched south towards Rome itself. Maxentius, who had initially planned to withstand a siege within the formidable Aurelian walls, was allegedly compelled by popular unrest and unfavorable omens to march his army out of the city and offer battle. The two forces met on October 28, 312 AD at an occasion north of Rome marked by a critical crossing of the Tiber River, the Milvian Bridge. It was on the eve of this decisive confrontation that an event occurred which would not only define Constantine's reign, but also fundamentally alter the trajectory of Western civilization. The historical accounts of this event are not uniform, they evolve over time, suggesting the narrative was refined for political and theological purposes. The earliest surviving account comes from the Christian rhetorician Lactantius, writing his work on the deaths of the persecutors only a few years after the battle. According to Lactantius, on the night before the engagement, Constantine was directed in a dream to have a heavenly sign of God marked on the shields of his soldiers. Lactantius does not describe a vision in the sky, nor does he specify the exact nature of the symbol referring to it, as a transverse letter X with a perpendicular line drawn through it and turned over at the top, a description consistent with the Christian monogram known as the Chi-Rho. A second, more elaborate and far more famous version of the story was recorded decades later by the Bishop Eusebius of Caesarea in his posthumous biography, The Life of Constantine. Eusebius claims to have heard the story from the emperor himself late in Constantine's life, and that the emperor attested to its truth with a solemn oath. In this account, the event is not a dream, but a waking vision. While marching with his army on the afternoon before the battle, Constantine and his soldiers saw a cross of light superimposed upon the sun, accompanied by the Greek inscription. The English rendering of this phrase is, "By this sign you will conquer." That night, according to Eusebius, Christ appeared to Constantine in a dream and commanded him to make a military stand at the Labarum, in the likeness of the sign he had seen in the heavens. This standard bearing the Chi-Rho monogram was to serve as a divine protection in all future battles. The historical veracity of either account is a matter of intense and unresolved scholarly debate. A clinical analysis, however, must focus on the political and ideological utility of the event. Whether a genuine supernatural experience, a meteorological phenomenon, interpreted through the lens of faith, or a calculated piece of psychological warfare, the result was the same. Constantine, who had previously associated himself with the pagan solar deity Sol Invictus, the Uncanurk sun, now publicly aligned his military campaign with the power of the Christian god. His soldiers, with the unfamiliar new symbol painted on their shields, advanced to battle the next day. The engagement at the Milvian Bridge was a comprehensive victory for Constantine. The forces of Maxentius were routed. In the chaos of the retreat, the makeshift pontoon bridge they were crossing collapsed, and Maxentius himself, weighed down by his armor, was thrown into the Tiber and drowned. The following day, Constantine entered Rome, in triumph, the undisputed Augustus of the West. He was no longer just another warlord victorious in a civil war. He was the divinely sanctioned instrument of the Christian god. The victory retroactively validated the vision. The event became the foundational narrative of his reign. The moment he was chosen by a higher power to rule and to protect the burgeoning Christian faith. This public persona, the pious warrior, saint the favored of God, was now immutably forged. It would become the official unassailable image of the emperor, an image that would stand in stark and silent contrast to the private familial tragedies that were yet to unfold. The victory at the Milvia Bridge consolidated Constantine's control over the entire Western Roman Empire, but it did not grant him dominion over the whole. In the east, a fragile alliance between Lichenes and Constantine had emerged, cemented in 313 AD by the marriage of Lichenes to Constantine's half-sister Constantia. This alliance was responsible for the Edict of Milanol and Mark proclamation that granted religious tolerance throughout the empire, formally ending the Diocletian persecution of Christians. However, the dual rule of two ambitious Augusti was inherently unstable. The partnership was a political convenience, not a shared vision for the empire's future. The first open conflict erupted in 316 AD. The Battle of Cblae in Pannonia was a bloody and narrowly won victory for Constantine, which forced Lichenes to cede the entire Balkan Peninsula with the exception of Thrace. A tense and uneasy peace followed for several years, a period historians refer to as a Cold War. During this time, both emperors consolidated their territories, strengthened their armies, and engaged in a war of propaganda. Constantine increasingly presented himself as the champion of Christianity, while Lichenes, despite his co-sponsorship of the Edict of Milan, began to renew persecutions within his eastern territories, viewing the church as a potential fifth column loyal to his rival. This growing ideological divide provided Constantine with a powerful justification for a final decisive conflict. He was no longer just a rival emperor seeking supreme power, he was a liberator of the oppressed faithful. The final war between Constantine and Lichenes began in the spring of 324 AD. Constantine, having amassed a formidable army of approximately 120,000 infantry and cavalry, crossed the Bosporus into Lichenes' territory. Lichenes commanded a larger force estimated at 165,000 men. The first major engagement took place at Adrianople on July 3, 324 AD. In a hard-fought battle, Constantine's tactical skill and the discipline of his veteran legions secured another decisive vertical skill in. Lichenes was forced to retreat to the fortified city of Byzantium. While Constantine besieged the city, the outcome of the war came to depend on control of the sea. Lichenes' fleet, under the command of his admiral Abantues, was significantly larger, numbering around 350 ships. It controlled the Hellespont, the narrow strait that connected the Aegean Sea to the Sea of Marmara, ensuring Byzantium could be repelled and preventing Constantine from easily crossing his army into Asia Minor. The task of breaking this naval blockade was entrusted to a commander who had until this point been primarily known for his successes on land, Constantine's eldest son Crispus. Crispus was given command of a smaller fleet numbering no more than 200 light vessels. What he lacked in numbers, however, he made up for in tactical innovation and aggressive leadership. The ensuing naval battle, fought in the constrained waters of the Hellespont, would be the defining moment of his career. Crispus led his fleet directly against the larger, less maneuverable ships of Abantues. Over 2 days of intense fighting, he systematically destroyed the Lycian navy. The victory was total and overwhelming. According to the historians, Osimus, 130 of the enemy ships were destroyed and over 5,000 sailors were killed. The Hellespont was now firmly in Constantine's control. The naval victory was the strategic turning point of the war. With his sea lanes cut, Lichenes abandoned Byzantium and withdrew his remaining forces to Chrysopolis, in Bithynia on the Asiatic side of the Bosporus. Constantine, using the fleet now commanded by Crispus, ferried his army across the strait. On September 18, 324 AD, the final land battle of the Roman civil wars was fought. The Battle of Chrysopolis was a rout. Lichenes' army was shattered, with tens of thousands killed or captured. Lichenes himself fled to Nicomedia. Initially, Constantine appeared to show clemency. At the intercession of his half-sister Constantia, Lichenes' wife, he spared the life of his rival. Lichenes was sent into exile in Thessalonica under the promise that he would live out his days as a private citizen. This promise, however, was short-lived. A few months later, in the spring of 325 AD, Constantine ordered his execution, citing a nebulous charge of treason or sporting. The son of Lichenes, a young boy who had once been named Caesar alongside Crispus, was also put to death. There were to be no more rivals. After 2 decades of relentless conflict, Constantine the Great was now the sole undisputed master of the entire Roman world. His rise was complete a testament to his military genius, his political ruthlessness, and in the crucial final stages, the brilliant performance of his heir. The victory over Lycianese was not just a personal triumph for Constantine. It was a career-defining moment for his son. Crispus's performance in the War of 324 AD had been nothing short of spectacular. He had not merely assisted his father, he had been the architect of the war's most critical strategic success. The destruction of the Lycian fleet in the Hellespont was a textbook example of superior tactics overcoming numerical inferiority. It demonstrated leadership, courage, and a sophisticated understanding of naval warfare. The victory was his, and the entire empire knew it. Following the final victory at Chrysopolis, Constantine celebrated his heir's achievements with a public display of honor. Crispus was lauded in official proclamations. A new series of coins was issued bearing his image with inscriptions such as CRISP, USA, ISSIMUSCIS, the valor of the Caesar. Panegyrics, TSDS. The official court orators composed lavish speeches praising his accomplishments, comparing him to the great military heroes of Rome's past. For a brief period, Crispus was alongside his father the most celebrated man in the Roman world. His military genius was not a sudden revelation. It was the culmination of years of practical experience. Since his appointment as Caesar in 317 AD, he had been actively governing and defending Gaul. His campaigns against the Germanic tribes on the Rhine frontier were not minor skirmishes, they were significant military operations that secured the borders and enhanced Roman prestige. He had proven himself to be a capable administrator and a beloved commander. The soldiers who served under him were reportedly devoted to him, a loyalty forged in shared hardship and repeated victories. He had developed his own comitatus, his own cadre of loyal officers and administrators, and his own power base in the western provinces. The contrast with his younger half-brothers was stark. While Crispus was winning decisive battles and governing a third of the empire, the sons of Fausta were still children. Constantine the eldest was only 8 years old in 324 AD. Constantius was 7 and Constans was a mere infant. They held the title of Caesar, but it was a purely honorific designation. They had no military experience, no administrative record, and no independent base of support. All their authority was reflective, derived entirely from their father, the Augustus, and their mother, the Empress. This disparity in age, experience, and accomplishment created an imbalance at the heart of the imperial succession. On one hand, there was a mature, proven, and highly popular heir in his mid-20s. On the other, there was a nursery of young princes whose primary claim to power was their maternal bloodline. The natural and logical course of succession would have been for Crispus to eventually succeed his father as the senior Augustus, with his younger brothers serving under him as Caesar's governing territories assigned to them, much as the original Tetrarch had intended. However, the logic of succession is oft unwarped by the emotional and political dynamics of a court. The very scale of Crispus's success could have been perceived as problematic. An heir who is too capable, too popular, and too independent can inadvertently become a rival to the reigning monarch. His fame, particularly with the legions, could make him a magnet for dissenters or a potential figurehead for a coup. There is no evidence to suggest that Crispus was disloyal, but in the paranoid atmosphere of the late Roman court, the perception of a threat was often as dangerous as the threat itself. Constantine, who had himself come to power through a military acclamation that defied the established system, would have been acutely aware of this danger. He knew that the loyalty of the army was the ultimate foundation of imperial power, and he now had a son who commanded that loyalty in his own right. The brilliant military career of Crispus, which had been so instrumental in securing his father's final victory, had also elevated him to a position of unprecedented prominence. He was no longer just the emperor's son, he was a conquering hero in his own right, the most celebrated general in the empire. This very success, the peak of his public life, was what made him vulnerable. He had perhaps become too bright a star in the Constantinian firmament. The adulation for Crispus was not confined to military and court circles. His victories were a source of public celebration throughout the empire, a welcome sign of stability and strength after decades of civil war. The Roman public, weary of internal conflicts, or in the young Caesar, the promise of a secure future. His youth combined with his proven competence made him an embodiment of the restored empire's vitality. This sentiment was reflected and amplified by the imperial mints. Coins are a crucial form of primary evidence for this period as they functioned as a form of mass media communicating the emperor's desired image to the populace. The coinage issued in Crispus's name following the victory of 324 AD is particularly telling. He is depicted as a martial figure, often in full armor, sometimes with a spear and shield or on horseback. The accompanying legends or slogans reinforce this image. Phrases like KLANANNIAD, EVICTL Ammonia Concordant GA, UDIUMROM, the NOAUM, the joy of the Romans, were minted in his name, directly linking him to specific military triumphs and the well-being of the state. These were not generic titles, they were specific and potent claims to personal achievement. By contrast, the coins of his younger half-brothers depicted them as princely youths, often with generic titles like SPESREIPUBLICA, either Hope of the State or simply NOBILISSIMUSCR. Their coinage represented potential. Crispus's coinage represented proven success. This popular acclaim was a double-edged sword. While it strengthened the dynasty as a whole, it also distinguished Crispus from the rest of the imperial college. He was not just one of the Caesars, he was the Caesar. This created a potential source of friction within the imperial family. The historian Eusebius of Caesarea, before the events of 326 AD, speaks of Crispus in glowing terms. He describes him as an emperor most dear to God and in all respects like his father. This praise from a prominent bishop and a close associate of Constantine indicates that Crispus was also seen as a champion of the Christian faith, further solidifying his support among that rapidly growing segment of the population. His popularity was a tangible political asset, but it existed within a system where all assets were constantly being weighed and measured by the supreme ruler. Constantine's own power had been built on a foundation of military popularity that usurped the established order. He understood better than anyone how a celebrated general could, with the backing of his legions, become an emperor. While he undoubtedly took pride in his son's achievements, a deep-seated paranoia was a structural feature of the Roman emperorship. The office was an autocracy, and autocracies are notoriously susceptible to succession crises. The very qualities that made Crispus an ideal are his military skill, his popularity, his independent base of support in the West also made him the most credible potential threat should he ever choose to become one. The pagan historian Osmus, in his later and hostile account, alleges that the popularity of Crispus was a direct cause of the ensuing tragedy. He writes that Crispus's fame excited the jealousy of his father. Whilst Osmus's narrative is simplistic and driven by an anti-Christian agenda, it points to a plausible political dynamic. The father-son relationship in the context of absolute power is unlike any other. The son is both the successor and the ultimate replacement. The emperor must build up his heir to ensure the continuity of the dynasty, but in doing so, he risks creating a figure powerful enough to supplant him. It is impossible to know Constantine's private thoughts to gauge the extent to which he may have felt threatened or overshadowed by his son's rising star. The surviving sources do not offer a psychological portrait. They only record the public actions and the catastrophic results. What is clear from the numismatic and epigraphic evidence is that by 325 AD, Crispus was at the apex of his power and prestige. He was the hero of the civil war, the beloved commander of the Rhine legions, the darling of the Christian church, and the celebrated subject of imperial propaganda. He was in every respect the perfect heir, and in the logic of the late Roman court, to be perfect was to be dangerous. The prince's popularity, far from securing his position, may have been the very thing that sealed his fate. While Crispus's renown was forged in the public theatre of war and celebrated on the metallic faces of coins, a different form of power was consolidating within the corrosted opulent world of the imperial palace. This was the domain of the Empress Fausta. Her influence was not measured in legions commanded or frontiers secured, but in proximity to the emperor and the control of access, and in the silent, persistent advocacy for her own bloodline. If Crispus represented the martial strength of the Constantinian dynasty, Fausta represented its political core and its reproductive future. Her position was not merely that of a consort. In 324 AD, following the final victory over Lichens, Constantine conferred upon both his mother Helena and his wife, was the highest honor a woman could achieve in the Roman state. It was not a symbolic gesture. The title of Augusta granted its holder immense prestige, a degree of legal and economic autonomy, and a formal public role in the imperial cult. Statues of Fausta were erected in major cities and coins were minted bearing her portrait and the legend F. Faustaaugustiiipiublica casting her like her sons as the hope of the state. She was no longer just the wife of the Augustus, she was an empress in her own right, a co-participant in the imperial majesty. This elevated status provided her with a platform, but her true power stemmed from her unique and unfiltered access to Constantine. In the highly formalized structure of the late Roman court, the emperor was increasingly isolated from his subjects, surrounded by layers of ceremony and a bureaucracy of officials. Fausta, as his wife and the mother of his younger sons, operated within the innermost circle. She was a constant presence in his daily life, a voice he heard when the generals, senators, and bishops had departed. This proximity is the single most potent currency in any autocratic system. It afforded her the opportunity to shape perceptions, to offer counsel, to subtly undermine rivals, and to promote allies, all outside the official channels of government. Her primary political objective, dictated by both maternal instinct and dynastic logic, was the advancement of her sons. With Crispus in his mid-20s, a celebrated war hero, her own children, still prepubescent boys, were at a significant disadvantage in the unspoken competition for succession. Crispus was a known quantity, a man with his own reputation and his own loyal followers. Her sons were as yet blank slates, their futures entirely dependent on their father's favor. For Fausta, ensuring their inheritance meant navigating a complex and treacherous political environment. Any action that elevated Crispus's status could be interpreted as a diminishment of her own son's future prospects. According to the narratives of later historians, particularly Zosimus and the Arian church historian Philostorgy, Empress Fausta did not remain a passive observer in this dynastic drama. They alleged that she began to actively work against her stepson. The mechanism for this was intrigue. The imperial court was a closed ecosystem rife with factionalism. A powerful Augusta could build a network of clients and informants, courtiers, high-ranking eunuchs who controlled the imperial bedchamber, cubicunarii, and administrators who owed their careers to her patronage. Through this network, she could gather information, spread rumors, and create an atmosphere of suspicion around a target. Zosimus's account is blunt. He claims Fausta developed a deep-seated animosity toward Crispus, fearing that his power would eclipse that of her own children. He portrays her as the prime mover in the tragedy, the manipulator who planted the seeds of doubt in Constantine's mind. While this account is written with a clear agenda to depict the first Christian emperor as a monstrous tyrant manipulated by his family, it reflects a plausible political reality. The tension between a popular heir from a first family and an ambitious empress with her own brood is a recurring archetype in the history of monarchies. It is crucial to note that no contemporary source records Fausta's actions or motives. The chronicles of Constantine's own time, like Eusebius, present the imperial family as a unit, a model of Christian piety. The story of the empress in the shadows pulling the strings of a conspiracy emerges only after the fact in the works of authors seeking to explain the inexplicable events of 326 AD. Yet the absence of contemporary evidence is not evidence of absence. Such palace intrigues by their very nature are conducted in whispers and leave no paper trail. Fausta's power was real, her maternal motivations were clear, and the threat posed by Crispus's success to her son's future was undeniable. While the legions on the Rhine celebrated their charismatic Caesar, a far more dangerous campaign was allegedly being planned in the silent marble halls of the imperial palace. The Roman imperial court of the 4th century was not merely a government or a royal household. It was a complex social and political organism governed by its own unique and unforgiving logic. It had evolved significantly from the Prince Appate of Augustus, where the emperor maintained the fiction of being the first citizen among peers. By the reign of Constantine, influenced by decades of military autocracy and the elaborate ceremonial practices of the Persians, Ascendite court, the emperor was a semi-divine figure, the dominus, or lord, increasingly separated from both the populace and the aristocracy by a wall of protocol and ritual. This physical and psychological distance created a system inherently susceptible to paranoia. The emperor's primary source of information was not open debate or a free press, but a tightly controlled flow of reports, petitions, and personal audiences. What the emperor knew of his empire and of the people within his own court was filtered through a hierarchy of officials, each with their own ambitions, allegiances, and animosities. A key institution within this system was the agentas in rebus, a corps of imperial dispatch carriers, who also functioned as a de facto secret police. Their official duty was to travel the empire, delivering messages and ensuring the smooth functioning of the imperial post. Unofficially, they were the emperor's eyes and ears, tasked with observing the activities of generals, governors, and high-ranking officials and reporting any hint of disloyalty or corruption directly back to the court. This created a pervasive atmosphere of surveillance where any unguarded word or questionable association could be relayed to the palace and interpreted in the most negative light. Suspicion was the default state of mind for a Roman emperor. The history of the previous century was a litany of assassinations, often initiated by trusted commanders or close family members. Power was a zero-sum game, and any potential rival, no matter how close, was a latent threat. Constantine himself was a product of this system. He had witnessed the violent collapse of Diocletian's Tetrarchy and had spent 2 decades eliminating his own rivals through force of arms. He knew that loyalty was conditional and that power was the only true security. This life experience would have instilled in him a profound and justifiable paranoia. Within the court, this paranoia manifested as a constant low-level political warfare. Factions coalesced around powerful individuals, a successful general like Crispus, or a high-ranking bureaucrat. These factions competed for imperial favor, which was the source of all appointments, honors, and wealth. The tools of this warfare were not swords and shields, but insinuation, rumor, and carefully timed accusations. A courtier's career and often his life could be destroyed by a whisper in the right ear. The legal framework of the period further amplified this danger. The Roman law of treason, or maestas, was notoriously broad and subject to abuse. Originally intended to punish actions against the Roman state under the autocracy, it was increasingly used to prosecute any perceived insult or threat to the person of the emperor. A vague accusation of plotting against the emperor, even without substantial evidence, could be enough to secure a conviction and a death sentence, particularly if the accused was already viewed with suspicion. There was no presumption of innocence. The emperor's suspicion was in itself a form of guilt. This was the environment in which the drama of Crispus and Fausta unfolded. It was a system where the emperor, isolated by his own majesty, was heavily reliant on the testimony of those in his immediate circle. It was a world where the lines between family and politics were completely blurred, where a dynastic rivalry could be framed as a treasonous conspiracy. The structural paranoia of the court provided the perfect incubator for the kind of intrigue that later authors would attribute to Fausta. She would not have needed to produce definitive proof of a plot by Crispus. All that was required was to plant a seed of doubt, to present ambiguous actions in a sinister light, and to leverage the emperor's inherent fear of betrayal. The system was primed to believe the worst, especially about a figure who had become, by virtue of his own success, too powerful to be entirely trusted. Against the backdrop of this internal world of suspicion and intrigue, the empire prepared for a monumental public spectacle. The year 326 AD was a landmark. It marked the 20th anniversary of Constantine's accession to power, an event known in Roman statecraft as the bicentennalia. In the turbulent history of the 3rd century, where emperors were fortunate to rule for 20 months, a reign of 20 years was a testament to extraordinary political success. It was a milestone of stability, a symbol that the era of crisis was definitively over. For Constantine, the sole ruler of a reunified empire, the bicentennalia was to be the capstone of his career, a celebration of his triumph and the dawning of a new golden age. The preparations for the Jubilee were extensive. The imperial propaganda machine, which had been finely honed over 2 decades of civil war, went into overdrive. Mints across the empire struck special commemorative coins. These coins did not just celebrate the emperor's longevity, they broadcasted a specific, carefully constructed ideology. Inscriptions proclaimed FEL, IXTL, IXTL, IXDA, IO the happy restoration of the times, and BEATATRA, NQ, ILLITAS blessed tranquility. Constantine was depicted not merely as a conqueror but as a restorer, the bringer of peace and stability. This bicentennalia was to be unlike any that had come before. It was the first to be celebrated by an openly Christian emperor. The previous year 325 AD Constantine had presided over the First Council of Nicaea. He had personally convened hundreds of bishops from across the empire to resolve the Arian controversy and to codify a unified Christian doctrine in the Nicene Creed. In doing so, he had cast himself as the supreme arbiter of the faith, a quasi-apostolic figure responsible for the unity of the Church, just as he was responsible for the unity of the state. The Vicennalia, therefore, was not just a political celebration but a religious one. It was intended to mark the triumph of a new Christian Roman order with Constantine as its divinely appointed head. The imperial family was central to this public display of power and piety. The imagery of the Domus Divina, the divine house, was crucial. Crispus, the victorious Caesar Fausta, the noble Augusta Helena, the dowager Augusta and mother of the emperor, and the young princes Constantini, I Constantius I and Constans were all integral parts of this tableau. They represented the dynasties past, present, and future. In public appearances, on monuments, and on coinage, they were presented as a harmonious, unified, whole model empire. The celebrations were meant to project an unassailable image of strength and continuity, reassuring the Roman world that the peace Constantine had won would endure for generations through his capable sons. The climax of the year-long jubilee was to take place in the city of Rome itself. The decision to travel to the old capital was freighted with symbolic weight. Constantine had spent little time in Rome since his victory over Maxentius. His strategic focus and his personal preference were for the East. He was already in the process of transforming the city of Byzantium into his new capital, Constantinople, a new Rome intended to be the center of his Christian empire. Rome, by contrast, was still the symbolic heart of the old pagan aristocracy. Its senate was a bastion of tradition and its temples still dominated the urban landscape. To celebrate his Christian jubilee in the ancient pagan capital was a complex political statement. It was an assertion of dominance over the old order, a demonstration that the new Christian dynasty was now the master of Rome's ancient legacy. It was also an act of reconciliation, a gesture to the Senate and the people of Rome, that they were not forgotten in the empire's new eastern-facing orientation. For this grand occasion, the entire imperial court was to undertake a state progress, a formal journey from the east where Constantine had been residing to the Italian peninsula. This was not a simple trip. It was a massive logistical undertaking, a mobile government of thousands of officials, guard servants, and family members moving slowly across the provinces. The journey itself was part of the celebration, a display of imperial majesty for the populations along the route. And so in the spring of 326 AD, at the very pinnacle of its public glory, the unified imperial family, the symbol of a restored and tranquil empire, began its fateful journey west. The imperial progress that departed from Nicomedia in the spring of 326 AD was a logistical and ceremonial marvel. It was the Roman state in microcosm, a moving capital city. At its heart was the Emperor Constantine and his family, his elderly mother Helena, the Augusta, his wife Fausta also, and Augusta, his eldest son and celebrated heir Crispus, the Caesar and Faust as three young sons, the junior Caesars Constantine I Constantius I and Constant. Surrounding this dynastic core was a vast retinue. The elite imperial guard units, the Scholae Palatina senators, and high-ranking ministers of the consistory, secretaries, scribes, and treasury officials, and a legion of servants, slaves, and artisans required to maintain the imperial standard of living on the road. The journey followed the great Roman military road, the Via Milita, that stretched west across the Balkan Peninsula. The progress was slow and deliberate, designed to be seen. As the imperial entourage passed through major cities like Adrianople, Philippopol, and Desiardica, it was met with orchestrated displays of public loyalty. Crowds gathered to cheer the emperor and his family. Local dignitaries offered speeches of welcome. The Vicennalia was being celebrated not just in Rome but along the entire route, enforcing the image of a unified empire paying homage to its savior. For an observer in the crowd, the sight of the emperor traveling with his accomplished heir and his young sons would have been a powerful visual affirmation of dynastic security. For weeks, the public face of the journey was one of harmony and celebration. The machine of state's ceremony functioned flawlessly. Behind the silken curtains of the imperial litters and within the temporary residences set up each night, however, the undocumented and unseen drama was reaching its breaking point. The precise moment and location of the rupture are not recorded in any surviving contemporary account. The official chronicles dedicated to celebrating Constantine's piety and success are silent. We are left to reconstruct the sequence of events from later often hostile sources and from the cold hard evidence of subsequent actions. The crisis appears to have erupted somewhere in Illyricum, the vast Balkan province that had been the recruiting ground for Rome's best soldiers for centuries in the region of Constantine's own ancestry. As the imperial progress moved from the city of Sirmium former Tetra, icy capital, and began its approach to the Italian peninsula, the atmosphere within the inner circle shifted from one of ceremonial duty to one of acute and terrifying crisis. The public facade was maintained, but a private internal process had been initiated. The target of this process was Crispus. What had begun as a journey to celebrate his father's reign and his own future role in it, had for him become a final inexorable march. He was separated from his own military command, surrounded by his father's guards, and isolated within the very entourage that was supposed to be honoring him. The physical destination of the imperial court was Rome, but the destination for Crispus was Pola, an important port city and administrative center on the tip of the Istrian peninsula in modern-day Croatia. Pola was a strategic location possessing a large amphitheater, a sign of its regional importance, and a secure imperial residence. It was here, far from the legions in Gaul who were loyal to him and away from the public eye of a major capital, that the decision presumably made by Constantine at some point during the journey was formally enacted. Upon arrival in Pola, Crispus was placed under arrest. The charge was not made public. There was no formal trial in the traditional Roman sense, no senatorial hearing or public court-martial. The legal process, if one occurred at all, was a summary proceeding, a cogniti io extraordinem, conducted in secret with the emperor himself as the sole judge and jury. The speed and secrecy of the action were absolute. The celebrated heir, the hero of the Hellespont, the man depicted on coins as the joy of the Romans, was now a state prisoner. The festive journey to Rome would continue for the rest of the court, but its character had been irrevocably altered. It was now a procession heavy with an unspoken and brutal secret. A father was taking his family to the ancient capital to be honored, having just ordered the arrest and impending execution of his own firstborn son along the way. The arrest of a Caesar was an event of seismic significance, yet the official record is a perfect, deliberate vacuum. No edict was published detailing his crimes. No proclamation was sent to the provinces to justify the action. The contemporary court historians who so meticulously recorded constant, honest legislativements and military victories make no mention of the matter whatsoever. The name of Crispus simply ceases to appear in their chronicles. This profound silence is the most immediate and telling piece of evidence. It suggests a scandal so deep, so familial, and so damaging to the carefully constructed image of the pious Christian emperor that it could not be explained away or politically spun. To find any explanation, we must turn to the writers of the following generations who, free from the immediate constraints of Constantine, Ascort attempted to fill in the void. These accounts, primarily from pagan or non-Orthodox Christian authors, are hostile to Constantinus' memory and must be treated with critical caution. Yet they are all we have, and on the central question of the accusation, they are remarkably, if perhaps suspiciously, consistent. The most detailed narrative is provided by the pagan historian Zosimus, writing in the early 6th century. According to Zosimus, the entire tragedy was engineered by the Empress Fausta. He alleges that she developed a passion for her stepson Crispus and made advances toward him. When Crispus, horrified, rejected her, Fausta's affection turned to vengeful fury. She went to Constantine and reversed the story, accusing Crispus of attempting to seduce her, a charge that implied an attempt at adultery with the reigning Augusta. The 5th century Arian historian Philostorgius, whose work survives only in a later summary, tells a virtually identical story. He states that Fausta was madly in love with Crispus and, upon being spurned, falsely accused him before the emperor. The gravity of such an accusation cannot be overstated. In the highly stratified and honor-bound world of the Roman court, an assault on the empress was not a mere personal transgression. It was an attack on the emperor's own person and dignity, a direct challenge to the sanctity of the imperial house. It constituted the highest form of treason, loies e majestas. This narrative, whether factual or a later invention, possesses a terrible political logic. It would have circumvented any defense Crispus might have mounted based on his military record or public loyalty. A charge of political conspiracy could be debated, its evidence weighed, But an accusation of this nature was intimate, shameful, and deeply personal. It would have triggered not just the cold calculus of the emperor but the primal rage of a husband and father. It was a charge perfectly calibrated to exploit the inherent paranoia of the autocrat, transforming the popular heir from a political asset into a source of profound personal betrayal. However, the very neatness of this story has led many historians to question its literal truth. The tale of a powerful stepmother falsely accusing a virtuous stepson after he rejects her advances is a well-worn literary trope in the ancient world. Its most famous iteration is the Greek myth of Phaedra and Hippolytus, a story well known to any educated Roman. In the myth, Phaedra, the wife of the hero Theseus, falls in love with her stepson Hippolytus. He rejects her and she in her shame and anger leaves a note accusing him of rape before taking her own life. Theseus, enraged, uses a curse from the god Poseidon to kill his innocent son. The parallels are too striking to ignore. It is possible that later historians, faced with an inexplicable family tragedy and an official silence, used this famous mythological template to construct a plausible, if not entirely factual, narrative. Other more prosaic theories have been proposed. Some scholars suggest the accusation may have been more overtly political, that Fausta convinced Constantine that Crispus was plotting a coup, perhaps using his popularity with the Western Magians as evidence. Others speculate about religious disagreements, suggesting Crispus may have been a more fervent adherent of Nicene orthodoxy than his father, who often sought compromise with the Arians. Yet these theories fail to adequately explain the extreme and personal nature of Constantine's reaction or the subsequent fate of Fausta herself. The story of sexual intrigue, whatever its source, remains the most persistent and, for many, the most compelling explanation for the sheer ferocity of the emperor's response. Ultimately, the precise accusation remains unproven. What is certain is that a charge was leveled, it was believed, and it was sufficient to convince a father to condemn his own son without a public trial or a chance for appeal. The choice of Pula was not accidental. The city was a significant naval base and an administrative center, yet it was geographically isolated from the major political and military power centers of the empire. It was distant from the Senate in Rome, whose members might have felt compelled to make inquiries, and it was a great distance from the legions of the Rhine frontier where Crispus commanded his deepest loyalties. It was a secure, controlled environment, the perfect location for an act of state that required both speed and absolute secrecy. Here the final act of Crispus's life would be carried out unobserved and unrecorded by the outside world. The legal proceedings, if they can be called that, were a formality at best and a fiction at worst. By the 4th century, the emperors were voluntaries principes had effectively become the ultimate source of law. For a charge as severe as high treason, especially one with intimate familial dimensions, the established procedures of Roman jurisprudence were irrelevant. There would be no senatorial inquiry, no public presentation of evidence, no advocate to speak in the defendant's favor. The trial was the emperor's judgment, and the emperor's judgment was the verdict. Constantine, acting as the supreme authority of the state, had already determined his son's guilt. The proceedings at Pula were merely the administrative prelude to a foregone conclusion. The sources are silent on the details of Crispus's final days or hours. We do not know if he was given an opportunity to face his accusers or to speak in his own defense. Given the speed of the events and the emperor's apparent conviction, it is highly unlikely. The state apparatus designed to protect the emperor's power was now turned inward with lethal efficiency against one of its own highest-ranking members. The officials charged with carrying out the sentence would have been men whose loyalty to Constantine was absolute and unquestioning. The execution was carried out with clinical dispatch. The exact method is not specified in the reliable sources. Later accounts prone to dramatic embellishment offer various possibilities. Some suggest poison, a common and discreet method for eliminating high-profile political figures. Others mention cold steel, implying a swift end by the sword at the hands of an imperial executioner. The 4th century historian Ammianus Marcellinus, a sober and generally reliable source, later referred to the event with the stark phrase, "He killed his son Crispus." He offers no detail, suggesting the act itself was so shocking that the specifics were secondary to the fact of it. While the life of the heir apparent was being extinguished in Istria, the imperial cortege continued its slow ceremonial journey towards Rome. Constantine did not remain in Pula to oversee the execution. He and the rest of the imperial family, including the Empress Fausta and her young sons, moved on maintaining the public schedule of the vice and en tour. This physical separation of the emperor from the act itself was a common feature of such state-sanctioned killings. The order was given and the machine of state carried it out, allowing the emperor to maintain a degree of public distance from the grim reality. The news, however, would have spread like a shockwave through the ranks of the traveling court. The sudden absence of the senior Caesar, a man who had been a central figure in the imperial entourage just days before, could not be hidden. His staff, his personal guard, his friends and allies within the court all had been thrown into a state of terror and confusion. A message was sent to the entire political and military establishment: no one was untouchable. If the emperor's own celebrated victorious son could be summarily arrested and executed in secret, then any official, no matter how high-ranking, served at the emperor's pleasure. The atmosphere of the bicentennial celebration, intended to be one of joy and tranquility, was now poisoned by an undercurrent of profound fear. The emperor's absolute power had been demonstrated in the most brutal and personal way imaginable. The execution of Crispus was not followed by a public announcement. It was met with an official silence that was as absolute as it was terrifying. The name of the Caesar, which had for years been included in public prayers and official oaths, in a highly ritualized and formulaic world of Roman administration, such an omission was not a clerical error, it was a definitive statement. Crispus had ceased to exist as a political entity even before his physical life was ended. The immediate effect on the imperial court and on the broader political class, as the news inevitably filtered out, would have been a wave of profound shock and fear. The Roman elite was no stranger to political violence, but the execution of a popular unaccomplished heir by his own father, in the midst of a jubilee celebrating dynastic stability, was an event of a different magnitude. It defied the established norms of even the most ruthless imperial politics. The logic of the act was opaque, known only to the emperor and his innermost circle. This very opacity amplified the terror. With the reasons for the Caesar's fall shrouded in secrecy, no one could feel secure. Any official who had been associated with Crispus, who had served on his staff in Gaul, or who had simply expressed admiration for his military successes, would now have feared for their own life. The imperial progress continued towards Rome, but the mood had been irrevocably altered. Upon arriving in Rome in the summer of 326 AD, Constantine's interactions with the city's elite were notably strained. According to the account of Zosimus, the emperor refused to participate in a traditional pagan ceremony, the Capitoline procession, which was a customary part of such imperial visits. This act deeply offended the still powerful pagan faction within the Roman Senate and the populace. While Zosimus frames this as a purely religious affront, it is plausible that the emperor's mood, darkened by the recent events, contributed to his unwillingness to engage in the expected public rituals. He was a man who had just killed his son, now being asked to play the part of the benign and triumphant ruler. The news of Crispus's death would have been received with disbelief and grief in the provinces he had governed and the army he had led. The legions of Gaul on the Rhine frontier, who had fought and won victories under his direct command, would have been particularly unsettled. For these soldiers, Crispus was not an abstract political figure, but their trusted general. The sudden, unexplained disappearance of their commander could have been a catalyst for mutiny. The fact that no such uprising occurred is a testament to the iron grip Constantine maintained over the military and the sheer shock of the event which may have paralyzed potential dissenters. It is during this period of simmering tension and official silence that another key figure enters the narrative: Flavia Julia Helena, Constantine's mother. The sources that describe her role, such as the Paschal Chronicle and the works of the historian Aurelius Victor, are late in their details, may be embellished, but they point to a plausible dynamic. Helena had always held a special position of influence with her son. She had been cast aside by his father for political reasons, but Constantine had restored her to a position of supreme honor, naming her Augusta. More importantly, she was Crispus's grandmother. She had known the boy since his birth and had witnessed his rise. According to these later traditions, Helena was deeply distressed by the execution of her grandson. She did not accept the official unspoken verdict. The sources suggest that she arrived in Rome possibly with the imperial court or shortly thereafter and began to make her own inquiries into the matter. As the Dowager Augusta, she possessed immense prestige and her own network of contacts. She was perhaps the only person in the emperor's judgment without fear of immediate reprisal. Her investigation, driven by a grandmother's grief and a deep-seated knowledge of court politics, would reportedly uncover the truth behind the accusation that had led to Crispus's death. This maternal investigation would set the stage for the second act of the tragedy, proving that the bloodshed within the imperial family was not yet over. The exact chronology of events following the arrival of the imperial court in Rome is uncertain, lost in the deliberate opacity of the historical record. The period covers a span of several months in the latter half of 326 AD. It was during this time, with the shock of Crispus's execution still fresh, that the focus of the internal court drama reportedly shifted. The agent of this shift, according to the later historical tradition, was the Dowager Augusta Helena. Helena's position in the court was unique. She was not merely the emperor's mother, she was a co-creator of the dynasty's public image of Christian piety. Following the Council of Nicaea, she had become a prominent patron of the church. In 328 AD, she would undertake a famous pilgrimage to the Holy Land, where she would allegedly discover the true cross and commission. The construction of major church of the Nativity in Bethlehem and the church of the Eleon on the Mount of Olives. Her reputation as a saintly figure was already being forged. This public persona gave her a moral authority that even her son, the absolute ruler, could not easily dismiss. The later Christian sources, which are generally sympathetic to Constantine, are the ones that most strongly emphasize Helena's role in uncovering the truth. This narrative serves a clear theological and political purpose. It helps to exonerate Constantine, or at least mitigate his guilt, by portraying him as the tragic victim of a deception rather than a monstrous tyrant. In this version of events, Helena, devastated by the loss of her grandson, used her influence and her network within the palace to investigate the circumstances of his condemnation. The details of her supposed investigation are not recorded. It would have been a perilous undertaking, conducted not through official channels, but through discreet inquiries and the leveraging of long-standing loyalties. She would have been seeking to answer a single vital question: was the accusation against Crispus true? The primary source of that accusation, according to the narrative laid down by Zosimus and others, was the Empress Fausta. Helena's investigation therefore would have logically focused on the Augusta and her inner circle. The scenario described by the historian Aurelius Victor, writing several decades later, suggests that Helena's relentless pressure eventually caused Constantine to have a profound and terrible realization. The emperor, consumed by what Victor calls great remorse, by night on your idolo, began to re-examine the evidence or the testimony he had been given. It is possible that Helena found a witness who had been coerced or uncovered a contradiction in Fausta's story. Perhaps she simply presented her son with the inherent implausibility of the charge, appealing to his memory of Crispus's character over a decade. The psychological dynamic between mother and son is key. Constantine's relationship with Helena was one of deep, publicly demonstrated respect. He had named a city Helenopolis in her honor. He had elevated her to the highest rank in the empire. She was a living link to his own past, a constant in his tumultuous life. Her grief and her insistence that a grave injustice had been done would have carried immense weight. According to this reconstruction, Helena's investigation succeeded. She managed to convince Constantine that he had been manipulated. He had been tricked into executing his own virtuous, loyal, and celebrated son. The rage and paranoia that he had directed at Crispus now turned with volcanic force upon the person he believed responsible for the deception, his wife, the Augusta Fausta. The tragedy was not over, it had merely found a new target. The system of absolute power, once activated, required a final terrible accounting. The fall of the Empress, which would follow with the same swift and silent brutality as the fall of the Caesar, was now inevitable. Helena's grief had not brought her grandson back, but it had, according to this narrative, set in motion the mechanism of revenge. The terrible engine of imperial justice, having consumed the son, now turned upon the mother of his successors. Constantine's conviction of his wife's culpability appears to have been as absolute and as swift as his prior condemnation of his son. The transition from accuser to accused was seamless, a terrifying demonstration of the emperor's arbitrary power. The exact nature of the charge leveled against Fausta is like the charge against Crispus unrecorded in any official document. We must again rely on the fragmentary and often biased accounts of later historians to reconstruct the accusation that brought down an Augusta. The crime as reconstructed from the hostile sources was twofold, with each part feeding into the other. The first and most immediate offense was the act of calumny of bearing false witness against a member of the imperial house, specifically the senior Caesar. If Helena's investigation had indeed proven that Fausta had fabricated the story of Crispus's advances, then Fausta was directly responsible for the judicial murder of the heir to the throne. In the context of Roman law, this was a capital crime of the highest order. She had used the emperor's trust and the mechanisms of state power to eliminate a dynastic rival, an act that destabilized the succession and stained the emperor's own hands with innocent blood. The second and perhaps more fundamental charge was adultery. This accusation is the logical inverse of the story told by Zosimus and Philos or Gaius. If Crispus had rejected Fausta's advances, then the advances themselves constituted a grave betrayal of her marriage vows. Some historical interpretations suggest an even darker possibility that Fausta was engaged in an affair with another man, perhaps a courtier, or an officer of the guard, and that she preemptively accused Crispus to create a diversion or to eliminate potential witness. For an empress, adultery was not a private moral failing, it was a public act of treason. It contaminated the imperial bloodline and cast a shadow of illegitimacy over her sons, the designated heirs of the empire. The very foundation of the Constantinian dynasty rested on the presumed fidelity of the Augusta. Any doubt about the paternity of the young Caesars Constantine I Constantitius I Constant would have been a catastrophic political crisis inviting future civil wars. The law on this matter dating back to the Emperor Augustus was severe. For women of the imperial family, the penalty for adultery was often exile or death. Like Crispus before her, Fausta was afforded no public trial. There was no senatorial hearing, no open court where evidence could be presented and challenged. Her guilt was determined within the silent chambers of the palace by the same man who had once elevated her to the pinnacle of power. Her fall from grace was instantaneous and total. The title of Augusta, the statues, and the public squares, the face on the imperial coinage, all became meaningless artifacts in the face of the emperor's wrath. Her network of clients and courtiers, which had likely been instrumental in the campaign against Crispus, would have evaporated overnight. To be associated with the condemned Augusta was to invite the emperor's suspicion upon oneself. She was now as isolated and powerless as her stepson had been in his final days at Pola. Constantine was now faced with a horrific political and personal reality. His celebrated heir was dead, a victim of a lie. His wife, the mother of his 3 remaining sons, was the architect of that lie and possibly an adulteress. The harmonious imperial family that he had projected to the world as the symbol of his stable Christian empire was a ruin shattered by betrayal and bloodshed. His reaction was not one of legalistic procedure, but of brutal, decisive damage control. The source of the corruption had to be excised as completely and as swiftly as Crispus had been. The decision was made. Fausta, who had been an Augusta of the Roman Empire for 2 years and Constantine's wife for nearly 20, was condemned to die. The emperor, who had presided over the Council of Nicaea, who was celebrated by bishops as God's chosen servant on earth, was now poised to execute his wife just as he had executed his son. The question was no longer one of guilt but of method. The execution of a Caesar had been a secret affair of state. The execution of an Augusta, the mother of 3 Caesars, required a different and perhaps even more chilling form of clandestine disposal. The execution of a Caesar, a high-ranking military and political figure, could be accomplished with the grim efficiency of state security. A sword or a dose of poison in a secure location was a standard, if brutal, to l'other of the 3 surviving heirs presented a different set of problems. The act could not be seen as a simple political elimination. It was the dissolution of the imperial marriage by the most extreme means possible. The method chosen needed to be discreet, contained, and above all, it needed to be deniable, capable of being framed as something other than a state-ordered killing. The chosen location was the private bathos of the imperial palace. The Roman thermae was a central institution of elite life, a place of hygiene, social interaction. The imperial residences contained lavish private versions of these complexes accessible only to the emperor's family and most trusted servants. Within this suite of rooms, the cold plunge frigidarium, the warm room tepidarium, and the hot room caldarium, the empress, could be isolated. The act would take place not in a dungeon or a military camp, but in the heart of imperial luxury, transforming a symbol of civilization into an execution chamber. The later sources, including Aurelius Victorin's Osimus, state that Fausta was killed by being locked in an overheated bath. The mechanics of this method are chillingly simple. The caldarium and its pools of hot water were heated by a sophisticated underfloor heating system known as a hypocaust. Hot air from a furnace was circulated through a raised space beneath the floor and channeled up through hollow tiles in the walls. This system allowed for precise temperature control. By continuously stoking the furnace and sealing the exits to the room, the temperature of the air and the water could be raised to lethal levels. From a forensic perspective, death under such circumstances could occur through several physiological mechanisms. The most probable cause would be acute hypothermia or heat stroke, as the ambient temperature rose far beyond the body's ability to cool itself through perspiration. The core body temperature would climb catastrophically. This would lead to a rapid breakdown of bodily functions. Cellular proteins would denature, the central nervous system would begin to shut down, leading to delirium and unconsciousness, followed by widespread organ failure. Death would be the result of a complete systemic collapse. A second possibility is asphyxiation. The air in the sealed, superheated room would be saturated with steam. Inhaling steam at a sufficiently high temperature can cause severe thermal damage to the larynx and lungs, leading to rapid swelling, fluid buildup, pulmonary edema, and suffocation. Furthermore, the hypocaust furnace, if deliberately manipulated to burn inefficiently, could have flooded the sealed chamber with colorless, odorless carbon monoxide. In this scenario, death would have been caused by poisoning, as the gas replaced oxygen in the bloodstream. This method would be even quieter and less violent than heat stroke. The most graphic interpretation suggested by the phrase "in a bath" is death by scalding. Fausta may have been forced into a tub of water that was then heated to an unsurvivable temperature, or the room itself was made so hot that the water and steam caused fatal full-body burns. In any of these scenarios, baking, suffocating, or boiling, the method was chosen for its defining characteristics. It was private, it required a minimum number of participants to execute, and it left behind a body that bore no marks of conventional violence, like a stab wound or the signs of strangulation. The death of the Augusta could, if necessary, be presented to the world as a tragic accident, a fainting spell in a dangerously hot bath, a malfunction of the heating system. This veneer of plausibility was crucial. It allowed the emperor to maintain a degree of public dignity while carrying out an act of extreme personal and political violence. The fate of Fausta was a suffocating, solitary end in a chamber designed for comfort and pleasure. The heat that had once been a symbol of Roman luxury was weaponized to carry out a silent, brutal sentence. The imperial house was cleansing itself, and the evidence of its internal corruption was being steamed away in the silent, marble-lined heart of the palace. With the physical bodies of the Caesar and the Augusta disposed of, the state turned its attention to the more complex and enduring problem of their memory. The events of 326 AD were a catastrophic failure of the imperial image, a stain on the carefully crafted narrative of a pious, harmonious, and divinely favored dynasty. The solution was not to explain the tragedy, but to erase it. The Roman state possessed a formal, if uncodified, procedure for such situations, a mechanism of political and historical sanitization, known as damnatio memoria, either condemnation of memory. This was not an act of spontaneous vandalism or more popular outrage. It was a deliberate, top-down administrative process designed to remove an individual from the collective official consciousness of the empire. For Crispus, the process was comprehensive. Across the vast expanse of the Roman world, on public monuments, triumphal arches, and milestones that bore his name and title, stonecutters were dispatched with chisels and mallets. Their task was to meticulously chip away the letters, spelling out FL, Davy, IUS, IUS, AOIS, PUSN, OBIS, ISB, USMUS, CIISS, IMUS, The result was not a clean slate, but an conspicuous rectangular void in the middle of a dedicatory inscription, a scar in the stone that to the literate observer spoke more loudly than the names that remained. His statues, which had been erected in the farms of countless cities and in the headquarters of military camps, were systematically pulled down. Bronze statues were melted down, the valuable metal recycled for new coinage or other imperial projects. Marble statues were often decapitated, the heads destroyed and the bodies sometimes recarved with the features of a new, more favored individual. His name was struck from the official records. In the military rolls of the legions he had commanded, in the lists of consuls and in the civic registers, his entry would be scraped away from the papiers or chiseled from the tablet. The goal was to create a historical reality in which the celebrated heir had in effect never existed. The same process was applied to Fausta. As an Augusta, her image and name were equally widespread. The inscriptions celebrating her elevation to the highest rank were now defaced. The coins bearing her portrait, which had circulated as symbols of dynastic legitimacy and fertility, were officially recalled. Treasury officers were ordered to remove them from circulation and send them to the imperial mints to be melted. This process was never perfectly efficient. Thousands of coins would have remained in private hands, buried in hoards, or lost to the soil, surviving to this day as physical evidence of the person the state tried to forget. Her statues were removed, her memory condemned. The purpose of this widespread state's ancient erasure was twofold. First, it was the ultimate act of punishment, extending the emperor's wrath beyond death itself. It denied the condemned not just their life, but their place in history, their legacy. For a Roman aristocrat for whom public honor and the memory of one's name, fama, was of paramount importance, this was a fate worse than a simple execution. Second, and more importantly, it was an act of aggressive political damage control. By removing the names and images of the two central figures of the tragedy, Constantine attempted to reset the narrative of his reign. The intention was to close the book on the affair so decisively that no one would dare to speak of it. For the three young sons of Fausta, this created a bizarre and tragic inheritance. Their own legitimacy and their claim to the throne were now derived from a mother whose memory was officially condemned. They were the sons of an unknown person. The erasure of Fausta was a necessary fiction to purify the dynasty, to sever the link between the future emperors and the source of the great familial corruption. The Damnatia Memoriae of Crispus and Fausta was the final silent act of the tragedy of 326 AD. It was an attempt to impose order on a chaotic and shameful series of events, to rewrite a chapter of history by physically tearing out the pages. The silence it created was deafening, a void in the public record that would for a generation stand as a chilling monument to the emperor's absolute power, to give and to take away not only life but existence itself. While stonemasons and bureaucrats were busy excising Crispus and Fausta from the physical and administrative record of the empire, a parallel process of erasure was taking place in the scripture immerse of the Christian intellectual elite. The most significant and perplexing silence comes from the man who was in the best position to know the truth and who had the greatest access to the Emperor Eusebius of Caesarea. Eusebius was not merely a bishop, he was a scholar, a theologian, and the preeminent historian of his generation. He was a close confidant of Constantine, a regular participant at the imperial court, and a fervent admirer of the emperor's mission. His ecclesiastical history, completed before the events of 326 AD, is a foundational text for the study of early Christianity. After Constantine's death, Eusebius would go on to write the Vita Constantini, or the Life of Constantine, a work that is not a critical biography in the modern sense, but a hagiography, a panegyric designed to celebrate the emperor as a model Christian ruler, a saintly figure chosen by God. In this extensive and detailed work, Eusebius meticulously chronicles Constantine's rise to power, his military victories, his legislative reforms, his patronage of the church, and his presiding role at the Council of Nicaea. He describes the emperor's vision at the Milvian Bridge, his piety, his charity, and his devotion to his family. He praises Helena's pilgrimage to the Holy Land. He celebrates the promise of Constantine's sons who would carry on his legacy. Yet in this comprehensive account of the life of the man he so admired, there is not a single word about the execution of his eldest son Crispus or his wife Fausta. This is not an accidental omission. Before the events of 326 AD in his ecclesiastical history, Eusebius had written of Crispus in the most glowing terms, praising him as a Caesar most dear to God. He had celebrated his role in the defeat of Lichines. But in the later Vita Constantini, Crispus vanishes. He is not mentioned as a commander in the civil war. He is not listed among the emperor's sons. His existence is completely and utterly ignored. The hero of the Hellespont, the Caesar praised by Eusebius himself, has been retroactively expunged from the official history authored by the court's most prominent intellectual. This silence is a deliberate act of historical curation. For Eusebius, the events of 326 AD presented an unsolvable theological and political problem. How could one reconcile the image of Constantine as God's chosen instrument on earth, the 13th apostle, with the brutal, inexplicable execution of his own son and wife? The facts were too monstrous to be incorporated into the hagiographic narrative. They contradicted the central thesis of his work, that Constantine's reign was a manifestation of divine favor. To include the tragedy would be to admit a profound and dark flaw in his hero, to suggest that the Christian emperor was subject to the same bloody tyrannical impulses as his pagan predecessors like Nero or Caligula. Unable to explain the events in a way that was favorable to Constantine and unwilling to record facts that would tarnish his legacy, Eusebius chose the only available path: total omission. His silence was not an act of ignorance, but an act of loyalty. He was protecting the emperor's reputation and, by extension, the reputation of the new Christian imperial order. His intended audience was posterity, and he was crafting a version of history that he wanted them to remember. The silence of Eusebius was mirrored by other Christian writers of the era. The great intellectual and bishop Athanasius of Alexandria, a key figure at the Council of Nicaea and a contemporary of the events, makes no mention of the affair in his extensive writings. The entire Christian intellectual establishment, which was so deeply invested in the success of the first Christian emperor, collectively averted its gaze. It was an act of communal forgetting, a conspiracy of silence designed to preserve the idealized image of the Constantinian revolution. This ecclesiastical silence is in its own way as powerful a testament to the horror of the event as any detailed account. It reveals the point at which the truth became too problematic for even the most dedicated of the emperor's propagandists to confront. The official story of the saintly emperor could only be maintained if the darkest chapter of his life was never written. The historical vacuum created by the Christian chroniclers did not remain empty for long. While the supporters of the Constantinian dynasty chose to erase the events of 326 AD, another intellectual tradition, one that was losing its grip on the empire, but had not yet lost its voice, chose to remember. This was the pagan narrative account of history that emerged in the decades and centuries following Constantine's reign. For these writers, the tragedy was not an inconvenient anomaly to be hidden, but a central defining crime that revealed the true nature of the emperor and the faith he championed. The most complete and influential of these hostile accounts comes from the historian Zosimus, a pagan official, who wrote his Historian of a New History in Constantinople around the turn of the 6th century. Zosimus was writing with a clear polemical purpose to argue that the decline of the Roman Empire was a direct result of its abandonment of the traditional pagan gods in favor of Christianity. In his view, Constantine was not a saintly hero, but the principal architect of this decline, and the murders of Crispus and Fausta were exhibit A in his case against the emperor. Drawing on earlier, now lost pagan histories, particularly the work of Eunapius of Sardis, Zosimus presents a lurid and detailed narrative that fills every gap left by Eusebius. He portrays Constantine not as a pious ruler guided by divine will, but as a man subject to fits of violent passion, a tyrant in the classical mold. The story he tells is the one that has come to dominate the popular understanding of the event. The Empress Fausta, consumed by a lawless passion for her handsome and virtuous steps, unmakes sexual advances. Crispus, a man of strict morality, rejects her. Fausta, fearing that Crispus will expose her to the emperor, preemptively accuses him of attempting to rape her. In Zosimus' Cest Ellen, Constantine flies into an uncontrollable rage. Without questioning the accusation or conducting a proper investigation, he immediately orders the execution of the son he had previously cherished. The narrative then incorporates the role of Helena. The emperor's mother, deeply grieved and suspicious of the affair, convinces Constantine of his tragic error. The emperor, overwhelmed by remorse, then devises a gruesome punishment for his wife. He orders her to be shut in an overheated bath where she is suffocated by the intense steam. But Zosimus adds another crucial layer to the story, one that directly attacks the legitimacy of Constantine's conversion. He claims that after the murders, Constantine was tormented by guilt and sought spiritual purification. He approached the priests of the traditional Roman religion, asking if there were any rites that could cleanse him of such heinous sins. The pagan priests, according to Zosimus, informed him that his crimes, patriarchy and the killing of his wife, were so profound that no existing ritual of purification was sufficient. His guilt was irredeemable under the old gods. It was only then, Zosimus argues, that Constantine turned to Christianity. He encountered a figure identified as an Egyptian who had come from Spain, almost certainly a reference to Bishop Osius of Cordoba, a key advisor, who offered him a radical new proposition. This Christian teacher assured the emperor that the Christian faith offered a path to forgiveness for all sins, no matter how grave. All that was required was repentance and baptism, and his slate would be wiped clean. For Zosimus, this was the true story of the conversion. It was not a divine vision before a battle, but a desperate, cynical act of a guilty murderer seeking a theological loophole. He embraced Christianity not out of sincere belief, but because it was the only religion that would offer him absolution for a crime the old gods could not forgive. This narrative is a masterful piece of character assassination. It recasts Constantine's most celebrated act, the Christianization of the empire, as a direct consequence of his most monstrous crime. The entire foundation of the new Christian state is in this telling, rooted in an unpunished double murder. Whilst Zosimus's account is invaluable for providing a coherent narrative where none would otherwise exist, its historical reliability is deeply questionable. The clear anti-Christian bias, the long chronological gap between the events and his writing, and the reliance on a well-known literary trope, the Phaedra and Hippolytus motif, all suggest that his account is more a piece of political theatre than a dispassionate historical record. Yet for nearly 2 centuries the Christian sources had remained silent. The pagan tradition in its anger rushed to fill that silence. The result is two diametrically opposed versions of history, one of saintly omission, the other of monstrous commission. While pagan and Christian historians waged a posthumous war over the emperor's soul, the practical business of empire demanded a clear and unambiguous line of succession. The brutal events of 326 AD had in their own terrible ways solved a complex dynastic problem. The tension between the two lines of imperial blood, the line of Minervina and the line of Fausta, was gone. Crispus, the proven and popular heir, was dead and his memory officially condemned. Fausta, the ambitious Augusta, had met a similar fate. All that remained were her 3 sons, Constantine I, Constantius I, and Constans. The future of the Roman world now rested entirely on the shoulders of these 3 boys, the eldest of whom was barely 10 years old. They were now in an extraordinary and politically untenable position. They were the sole heirs to the most powerful man in the world, yet their legitimacy was derived from a father who had just executed their mother and officially erased her from history. Their claim to power was built upon a foundation of state-enforced amnesia. Any public mention of their maternal lineage was now an act of treason. Their identity was to be purely patrilineal. They were the sons of Constantine, and that was to be the beginning and the end of their story. Constantine, for his part, proceeded with a chilling pragmatism. Having surgically removed the perceived threats within his family, he focused on grooming his remaining sons to rule. There was no other option. To disinherit the sons of Fausta would be to leave the empire without a successor, inviting the very chaos and civil war he had fought for 2 decades to end. The dynastic plan continued, but with 2 of its central figures missing. In the years following 326 AD, the 3 young Caesars were systematically elevated. They were granted titles and given nominal authority over vast swaths of the empire, mirroring the Tetrarch. Model their father had both served and destroyed. Constantine I, the eldest, was assigned to the Gallic provinces, the former power base of the disgraced Crispus. Constantius I, perhaps the most capable and certainly the most ruthless of the 3, was given command of the East, the wealthiest and most strategically complex part of the empire. The youngest, Constans, was eventually given control of Italy, Africa, and Pannonia. Their upbringing was a carefully managed imperial curriculum. They were given a Christian education, instructed by tutors like the scholar Aemilius Magnus Arborius. They were trained in military arts and the science of administration. And they were undoubtedly taught a heavily redacted version of their own family history. They grew up in a court where the names of their half-brother and there was the unconnubied foundation of their own rise. This upbringing in a world of absolute power, defined by a foundational act of familial violence and secrecy, would shape them into suspicious, often cruel and perpetually rivalrous rulers. For the final decade of his life, from 327 to 337 AD, Constantine ruled as a solitary, almost Olympian figure. He focused his immense energies onto great projects: the formal establishment of Christianity as the favored religion of the state and the construction of his magnificent new capital, Constantinople, which was formally dedicated in 330 AD. The events of 326 AD He seemed to have accelerated his turn away from the old Rome, the city that had been the stage for the final act of his stage. On his deathbed in a suburb of Nicomedia, Constantine the Great received Christian baptism, a common practice at the time to ensure the washing away of a lifetime of sins just before entering the afterlife. His final act was to formalize the division of the Roman world. He bequeathed the empire not to a single successor but jointly to his 3 sons. They were no longer to be Caesars serving under a supreme Augustus. They were now to be co-equal Augusti, each ruling their assigned portion of the empire. The tragic irony of this final arrangement is profound. The entire bloody affair of 326 AD, the elimination of the most competent heir and the execution of the Augusta, was predicated on the need to secure a stable and orderly succession. Yet the solution Constantine ultimately implemented was a recipe for the very thing he sought to avoid. He had replaced the elegant if flawed theoretical structure of Diocletian's Tetrarchy with a hereditary system based on a tripartite division of power among 3 young, inexperienced, and mutually distrustful brothers. The succession of Fausta's sons was secure, but the peace of the empire was not. Almost immediately after their father's death, a bloody purge of other male relatives of Constantine was carried out by the army, likely at the instigation of Constantius II, to eliminate any other potential claimants to the throne. Within a few years, the 3 brothers would be at war with one another. The house that Constantine built on the ashes of his first family was, it turned out, no more stable than the one it had replaced. The death of Constantine in 337 AD did not end the debate over his legacy, it merely began a new and more contentious phase. For centuries, historians, theologians, and political theorists have grappled with the profound contradiction at the heart of his reign. How could the man celebrated by the Christian tradition as Constantine the Great, the pious emperor who ended the persecutions and laid the foundation for a Christian Europe, be the same man who in a single year executed his blameless son and his wife of 2 decades? The attempts to reconcile these 2 irreconcilable figures, the saint and the killer, provide a fascinating case study in the construction and manipulation of historical memory. The first and most enduring approach was that of the Christian hagiographic tradition pioneered by Eusebius. This method was simple denial through omission. By refusing to acknowledge the events of 326 AD, the Orthodox Christian narrative could present an unblemished portrait of the emperor. The silence of Eusebius, Athanasius, and others created a sanitized official story that was propagated for generations. In this version, Constantine was a righteous warrior for the faith and his family was a model of Christian virtue. The story of Crispus and Fausta was not reconciled, it was simply buried. This approach was highly effective, particularly in the Eastern Roman Byzantine Empire, where Constantine was venerated as a saint equal to the apostles. The dark chapter was treated as hostile pagan slander unworthy of serious consideration. The second approach, epitomized by the pagan historian Zosimus, was one of enthusiastic condemnation. This narrative did not seek to reconcile the 2 persons, but instead argued that the killer was the true Constantine and the saint was a fraudulent public image constructed to mask his monstrous nature. For Zosimus and his intellectual heirs, the executions were not an aberration, but the key that unlocked the emperor's true character. His piety was a sham, his conversion a cynical ploy for absolution. This hostile narrative, while rich in detail and psychologically compelling, was equally a product of its own agenda. It was a polemical attack designed to discredit not just the man, but the entire religious and political transformation he represented. It sought to resolve the contradiction by declaring one side of it a complete fabrication. A third, more nuanced approach emerged over time, particularly among later, more detached observers. This interpretation attempts a form of psychological or political rationalization. It accepts the basic facts of the executions, but seeks to mitigate Constantine's culpability by framing him as a tragic figure, a victim of circumstance and manipulation. In this view, which often draws on the tradition that Helena uncovered the truth, Constantine is not a cold-blooded tyrant, but a man deceived by a cunning, ambitious wife. His execution of Crispus was a terrible mistake and error of judgment, made under the influence of a monstrous lie. His subsequent execution of Fausta is then cast not as a second act of tyranny, but as a just if brutal act of retribution. This narrative arc, with its elements of betrayal, tragic error, and righteous vengeance, transforms a sordid palace intrigue into a high tragedy. It allows for a more complex and sympathetic portrait of the emperor, acknowledging his brutality but attributing it to a temporary manipulated passion rather than an innate wickedness. Finally, there is the approach of modern secular historiography, which tends to view the events through a lens of pure political science. This perspective is less concerned with the emperor's moral character or the sincerity of his faith. Instead, it analyzes the events of 326 AD as a brutal, but rational, if miscalculated act of political survival. The court is seen as a system, a dangerous environment of competing factions. Crispus, by virtue of his success and popularity, had become a destabilizing element, a potential rival. Fausta, as the mother of the other heirs, had a clear political motive to eliminate him. Constantine, as the absolute ruler, faced a choice between his popular son and his royally born wife and her children. His decision to eliminate both may have been, in his own cold calculus, a necessary measure to secure the dynasty and prevent a future civil war. In this reading, the murders are not a matter of passion or piety but of power. Each of these four approaches, denial, condemnation, logic, rationalization, and political analysis, is an attempt to impose a coherent narrative on a series of events that defy easy explanation. They reveal as much about the biases and priorities of the historians as they do about Constantine himself. The enduring mystery of 326 AD is not just what happened, but why. The profound contradiction in Constantine's character has ensured that his legacy remains a battleground, a place where the image of the saint and the shadow of the killer are locked in a perpetual unresolved conflict. In the final analysis, the most enduring legacy of the tragedy of 326 AD is the void it left behind. It is a story defined not by the evidence that exists, but by the evidence that was systematically destroyed. The chiseled-out names on stone inscriptions, the melted-down coins, the expunged passages in official histories, all testify to a concerted effort by the most powerful state in the Western world to control its own memory, to surgically remove a moment of profound shame from its official narrative. This act of erasure, more than any lurid account from a later historian, speaks to the depth of the crisis and the magnitude of the crime. The silence of the contemporary Christian sources is particularly resonant. It reveals the fragility of the new imperial ideology that Constantine was constructing. The fusion of Roman absolute power with Christian moral authority was a revolutionary concept, and the events of 326 AD threatened its very foundation. The court intellectuals and theologians, faced with a patron who was both their champion and a brutal familial executioner, chose to protect the project by ignoring the inconvenient truth. They wrote a history of the triumph of the church, but in doing so they left a gaping hole in the history of the man who made that triumph possible. Their silence became a form of complicity, a deliberate turning away from the darkness that lurked beneath the gilded surface of the first Christian empire. Into this void stepped the hostile pagan narrative. For writers like Osimus, the silence of the Christians was an invitation, an opportunity to write their own version of events unconstrained by the need to protect the emperor's reputation. They filled the void with a story of lust, betrayal, and cynical religiosity that was as biased in its own way as the hagiograph of abuse. The result is a historical paradox. The most detailed accounts of the event are also the least trustworthy. We are left to reconstruct the truth from the echoes and shadows, from the space between a history that says nothing and a history that says too much. The succession of Fausta's sons, the very outcome the tragedy was meant to secure, ultimately failed to bring the stability Constantine craved. The brothers, raised in a court defined by paranoia and an unspeakable secret, turned on each other with a ferocity that mirrored their father's. Constantine I was killed in an ambush while invading the territory of his youngest brother Constans in 340 AD. Constans himself was later assassinated by the use of Pomagni Ntius in 350 AD. This left Constantius I, the middle son, to reunite the empire through yet another bloody civil war. The house of Constantine, built on a foundation of fratricide and marriage, nearly consumed itself within a generation. The legacy, therefore, is not a clear moral lesson but a profound and unsettling ambiguity. Constantine remains one of the most consequential figures in world history. His decisions shaped the political and religious map of Europe for 1,000 years. He was a brilliant general, a visionary administrator, and a political revolutionary. He was also a man who in the crucible of absolute power committed an act of familial cruelty that places him alongside the most notorious tyrants of the Roman tradition. The story of Crispus and Fausta is a testament to the corrosive nature of unchecked authority and the inherent dangers of a closed, paranoid court. It demonstrates that the line between the private passions of a family and the public actions of a state can dissolve entirely when the family and the state are one and the same. The silence that was meant to bury the story has ironically ensured its immortality. It compels us to keep searching, to keep questioning, and to recognize that even in the most well-documented periods of history some truths remain forever lost in the darkness, leaving behind only a legacy written in silence. And so the official record, scarred by its own omissions, falls silent. The dust settles in the archives. We are left in the quiet of the aftermath, contemplating the impossible calculus of a man who held the world in his hands, but could not hold his own house together. The figures of Crispus, the brilliant son, and Fausta, the doomed empress, recede back into the shadows of the 4th century, their true motives and final words lost to us forever. Their story serves as a clinical reminder that the grand narratives of history, the rise of empires, the triumph of faiths, are often built upon foundations of intensely personal and deeply human tragedy. The machinery of state, once set in motion by suspicion and fear, is relentless and does not distinguish between a foe, an enemy, and a firstborn son. The account is finished, but the silence that follows is heavy with judgment. Whose side would you have been on? The article ends.